Good evening and welcome to From the Stacks, the live stream program of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Today is Tuesday, June 29, and this is the last program of the month for us. We started this month off with my good friend John Hodges, the director of the Center for Western Studies in Memphis, Tennessee, and we're ending the month with John Hodges again. Because frankly, that first week of the month, John's and my conversation just got too interesting in the early parts, and we never really got to the main focus for why I'd asked him to come onto the program. So tonight we're going to finish that up with John. It's great to have him back on the program. Before we go to John, let me just tell you a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. We're an evangelical Christian ministry dedicated to educating the public and policymakers on three things simultaneously and interwoven. They are biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ. We tie those things together in recognition that God, as the creator and redeemer, claims ownership of all the world, and in Genesis 1:28, he assigned to mankind the call to exercise a godly stewardship, or I prefer the biblical word dominion, over this earth, a dominion that reflects his own dominion, shown in the earlier verses of Genesis chapter 1, where God created all things out of nothing. He brought light out of darkness, order out of chaos, life out of non-life, and great variety of life. And he told every different variety of life to be fruitful and multiply and fill its niche in the earth. And then he created mankind, Adam and Eve, in his own image, male and female created he them. And he blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and have dominion, subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth. This is the tremendous responsibility and the tremendous privilege that human beings have, made in the image of God, to reflect him in our use of the earth. The Cornwall Alliance is a network of just under 70 different evangelical Christian scholars. About a third are natural scientists, biologists, chemists, physicists, meteorologists, climatologists, oceanographers, geologists, and more. And they bring the insights of the physical sciences, the natural sciences, to our work. About a third are economists, whether fairly standard economists focusing on macro or microeconomics, or more frequently, economists with special attention to economic development, how societies rise and stay out of poverty, or environmental economics, how we can bring the insights of economics, the principles of economics, to bear on the choices we make to pursue policies that will have good effect on our natural environment, how we can be ecologically good stewards while being economically wise as well. And all of this comes around back to the gospel of Christ, because we cannot exercise either our dominion over the earth or our economic activities in a godly way until we're reconciled to God. Because all of us have sinned. We fell into sin in our common father, Adam, and all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God ever since then. And we can be reconciled to God when we repent of our sins and embrace Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as our Savior and our Lord, who on the cross paid the penalty for our sins, and in his resurrection triumphed over condemnation and judgment and brought justification to us. That is the forgiveness of sins and the pronouncement, the judgment that we are righteous in the sight of God. That's a truly amazing thing, and we are excited to be able to weave that gospel into all the work that we do at the Cornwall Alliance. Every month, the Cornwall Alliance offers a free gift as our way of saying thank you when people make a donation to us, 100% tax deductible, of literally any size. And this month, the month of June, being the sixth month of the year, we're offering this book, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth, by my friend Jim Hollingsworth. He is sort of a polymath scientist. That's somebody who's done a lot of scientific work in a lot of different fields. And he wrote this book in a rather, I think, interesting and helpful way. There are 48 chapters. Each one of them runs typically 2 to 3 pages long. And the text is always clear, straightforward, written really to be understood by anybody with, say, a 10th grade education. And they answer all kinds of questions about climate change, about the scientific study of climate change, its causes, its consequences, and about the economic and political studies of how we respond to climate change, whether we ought to adopt a drastic and sudden transition from fossil fuels, which currently supply roughly 85% of all the energy that human beings use in the world, to renewables like wind and solar, which currently provide less than about 7% of the world's energy. These are serious questions, and Jim Hollingsworth has addressed these things, I think, very, very well. And if you'd like to receive your free copy, you do still have, well, just a little bit over 24 hours to request it. The offer ends at midnight tomorrow, the 30th of June. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And then as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, write in promo code 21-06. That's for the sixth month of 2021. Promo code 2106, or write in the full title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Be sure to use the full title because we have other resources that are also titled starting off with the words climate change. So we want to be sure that we know what it is you're asking for. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's great to have you with us. And now we'll bring in our friend John Hodges, the director of the Center for Western Studies. John is not only a good friend of mine, but he's also a very fine musician, a wonderful singer, a symphony conductor, a composer, and in fact, I'm going to ask him to tell us a little bit about a musical that he has been composing. And I guess you don't just compose a miracle, you screenwrite it, and you stage play it, you write all the dialogue for it, you develop the characters, you have a plot and all of that. It's a rather amazing thing. It's something I think far beyond anything that I would be able to do along those lines. But John's been working on that, but his main thing is as the director of the Center for Western Studies. And John, just quickly tell us a little bit about the Center for Western Studies and how people can learn more about it.
Very good. Well, thank you, Cal. It's always good to see you. And thanks for giving us an opportunity to plug our center here. We run an organization called the Center for Western Studies that gives young people a gap year opportunity, gap year between high school and college, to come and study with us to accomplish two things: to get a sense for a Christian view of the world, and to get a sense for applying that Christian view of the world to the history of Western ideas, starting with the Greeks and working their way forward through to today. It's a year program, so you can imagine we can only do so many books and so on, but we read literature, the great books, we read, listen to music and deal with, analyze music and art and architecture, and in each case, evaluating the ideas that have influenced Western civilization, we think, the most. We feel like the Western civilization is increasingly getting short shrift at the university level. It seems like not only is there an upsurge in the last 20, 30 years of disdain for this country, for the United States, but also for Western civilization in general, and I think underneath all of that, for the Judeo-Christian heritage that really informs our Western civilization. And the West is the place where that Judeo-Christian history, heritage, has had the most influence, the longest, let's say, influence, the longest time to incubate, as it were, within the culture. So we don't claim that Christianity is, or that Western civilization is Christian per se, but we say that it's been influenced by Christianity more than any other geographical area in the world. And there's a long conversation that starts before Christ with the Jews and with the Greeks that come to a head in the New Testament and then into what we call Western civilization now. So we think that it's a worthy study to know our own cultural background. So we take students for a year between high school and college and do a kind of tutorial year with them on those subjects.
Yeah, and it's a really, I think, just an outstanding program. Our youngest daughter, Grace, went through the Center for Western Studies back in, what was it, 2012 or 13, something like that.
2012, maybe so, yeah. It's been a while now, hasn't
Quite
it?
a while. Yeah, and later found her husband here in the Memphis area, and I guess we need to give the Center for Western Studies credit for drawing her here in the first place to find him. But it's because of that that we wound up moving here as well. But the Center for Western Studies program is so rich, so mentally stimulating and edifying that my wife, who went to Hillsdale College back in the 1970s, told our daughter that she believed that Grace got more out of her 1 year at the Center for Western Studies than my wife, Debbie, did in an entire 4 years at Hillsdale College. So I think that's a pretty high recommendation. And so we would certainly recommend recommend the Center for anyone who is approaching graduation from high school. Now, John is actually not taking any students this coming year, and instead he's using this year off to finish the work on his musical that he is writing. So the next year for which students can come is the 2021-2022 academic year. I'm sorry, the 2022-2023. Yeah,
that's
22-23 academic year.
Fall of 22.
And, so the aim, in terms of my own, one of my own desires for tonight is simply to whet some appetites to bring you some applicants to study at the Center for Western Studies in the academic year beginning August of next year, August of 2022. So, but just quickly, John, tell us a little bit about your the musical that you're working on.
Okay.
What are the prospects for production and so on?
Yeah. Well, I have a partner, and he and I have been working on this musical for a while. It's based on the story of Rumpelstiltskin, and we have written out a plot for it. Of course, we've written 15 songs for the show, and then we've written a sketchy plot that we then turned over to a professional writer from Chicago who helped us write a script, and then we've been working on that script off and on to try and tighten it up. And we have some producers that are interested in backing it, so we've got some interest in getting it to New York to be read in the spring of next year. That's the plan. And we are hoping that we will find then that there's enough interest among the producers and potential producers and directors and designers and so on that would come and see the sort of rough run of it in a location in New York that would want to see it produced somewhere. We know that everybody and Aunt Matilda wants to have a show on Broadway, so we know how unlikely it is that it will actually work. But so far, God has opened doors for us, and we're pleased to walk through them as we go. But it's a fun show. It's got a lot of interesting kinds of music in it, kind of varied styles of music, and it's got a romance. We've written a romance into the original fairy tale, and part of it is in the present day, and part of it is in the fairy tale, the fairy tale has an effect on the way people are living in the present day. So it has some kind of interesting wrinkles to it, we think, anyway.
Yeah, John, our basic topic for this evening is planned to be to discuss, waking up to woke. That is how social justice, critical race theory, the woke movement are infiltrating churches, and they've pretty well taken over a great deal of the academy and so on. And we're going to look into those in some depth in the rest of the program. But before that, I just want to finish up a little bit of a survey that we did last time, beginning of this month. We ran through some of the basic texts that you have your students study as they go through the Center for Western Studies.
Right.
Last time we got to C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, Homer's Odyssey, Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity, Augustine's amazing Confessions, Dante's Inferno. Tonight I want you to comment on just three more, why you include them in the course and what your students stand to gain from them. First off of those is Shakespeare's Hamlet. So tell us a bit about why that. How does that contribute to a student's appreciation of Western civilization?
Well, Hamlet was begun in 1599. So that's the end of the 16th century. That was also the birth of the Reformation, earlier in the century, obviously. And the influence of the Reformation on Europe, and England in particular, is profound. And we think of Hamlet as one of the first sort of post-Reformation tragedies. It has its own inner conflict that we think has a lot to do and a lot to say about the split between the Roman Catholic authority and the Protestants that were trying to reform the church on the other side. And it manifests itself in Hamlet's indecision throughout the first four acts of the play. And we think that it's a very Christian play in that sense, and that by the fifth act, Hamlet has had an experience that gives him a far more trust in providence. He's wondering what to do for four acts, and then suddenly in the fifth act, he's peaceful and calm and goes through the motions of the end of the play. And all of that is, we think, based on an understanding of providence and Shakespeare's position there at the end of the 16th century to speak, in a way that expresses the day. So Hamlet is a great play in a whole bunch of different ways, but one of those ways is that it speaks of the European man at the turn of the beginning of the 17th century.
Yeah, and it's just it's a really gripping play. I think a lot of people count it as Shakespeare's best, which is really saying something, because pretty much all of Shakespeare's plays were so truly amazing. Another one that you're having them read is Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. I first read that myself back in 1982, I believe it was, and was simply floored by the brilliance of Edmund Burke. And this is a book that a lot of historians, particularly English historians, say played a huge role in sparing England, and with it Wales and Scotland, from going through the same thing that France did with the French Revolution. In fact, a lot of historians say really there were just two things that prevented that from happening. One was Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France. The other was the preaching of John Wesley, which brought so many Englishmen to faith in Christ and to learn of the providence of God and of the biblical understanding of community and of how we need to love and care for our neighbors and so on. and this was quite different from the passions of the French Revolution. But why do you particularly include this work in the readings for the center?
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's a a lot of people think of the Enlightenment as the age of revolution. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, the, the sort of civil wars that happened in the beginning part of the 19th century in France after Napoleon, and so on. It's a time between 1750 and 1850 that is full of a lot of unrest in Europe and in America and so on. And Burke, a lot of times, though, all those revolutions get kind of lumped together as though they're all of a piece. And we think that the American Revolution and the French Revolution were very different, and the roots of those differences are so well expressed by Edmund Burke. Burke was actually in favor of the American Revolution and very much against the notion of the French Revolution, and for a whole lot of reasons that we could talk about. But that we want our students to be discerning about that time period. And Burke is, maybe some people say Burke is the beginning of modern conservatism at that point. And many people that we both appreciate were inspired by Burke, not the least of whom was T.S. Eliot and Russell Kirk in the 20th century, both in the 20th century. So that book just is a central book for the understanding of what a conservative mind expresses. He talks about the idyllic imagination that he associates with Rousseau and the French Revolution, and what he calls the moral imagination that he associates with Christianity and with the American Revolution.
Yeah, one of the points that Burke makes is that that revolutions, and he actually called the American War of Independence a revolution not made but prevented, because the real revolution that was going on was King George III trying to assert authority to impose his will, and Parliament trying to assert the authority to impose its will on the colonists without allowing them representation in Parliament. And so that was the actual revolution going on, and the American War of Independence prevented that revolution. And Burke recognized that, which is why he supported independence for the colonies. But Burke also warned that that democracy is very easily misunderstood. If we simply see democracy as the majority vote of the current generation, then we're actually falling into the tyranny of the minority, because the current generation is a minority of all people who've ever been around. And so he spoke instead of the democracy of the dead, and that if we are to show any respect at all for our ancestors, as we hope that our descendants will show respect for us, we need to take their thinking into account and not just simply impose our own fleeting new ideas without careful consideration of the past. It ties into George Santayana's very famous quote, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And this, I think, is something that Burke was totally dedicated to, was helping people to see the unity of civilization across the generations, as well as within a particular time period. This, I think, brings the wisdom of our ancestors to bear on the problems that we face ourselves. And I think that forgetfulness of the past is something that is particularly threatening America even today. Earlier today, I was listening to the Bill Walton Show, which is an interesting podcast, and he was interviewing a couple of different scholars on the question whether we are being condemned to repeat the terrors of communism because we've forgotten our past. That's
Yes.
a podcast
Nice.
that I would recommend to people, The Bill Walton Show. Um, and so that kind of brings us to the last of these three other texts that you have your students read at the Center for Western Studies. And there are plenty more texts too, but we just didn't want
You've
to
just
go into
picked
all
out
of them.
three that you wanted to ask about. Yes. Right.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think it was six last time that you were on.
Oh, yeah.
But this last one is the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Um,
Right.
this is kind of who was the great Chinese military strategist who said that it's if you want to succeed in warfare, you need to know your enemy. Is that kind of what you're looking
Yeah.
for in having the students
Well,
read
maybe
Marx
so.
and
Sure. Are you thinking of Sun Tzu? Is that Sun Tzu?
Sun Tzu? Yes, Sun
Sun
Tzu.
Tzu.
Yeah.
I see. If since we're interested in the ideas that have most profoundly affected Western civilization, Marxism has been one of the most influential since 1848 when he wrote
Absolutely.
the Communist Manifesto. Dostoevsky starts wrestling with him even before the century's over, and we know that by 1917, of course, the Russian Revolution has taken over in Russia. Well, the Communist Manifesto is is an argument in favor of dividing the populace into middle class bourgeoisie and lower class proletariat and pitting them against each other. Whereas in the past, uh, classes like that have seen a kind of camaraderie, a kind of way of cooperating. And Marx exploited the natural sort of jealousy and envy. And frankly, I think if we were to teach the Tenth Commandment, people wouldn't take Marx very seriously. But we don't. We've forgotten that.
John, hold on a second, John. When
Yeah,
I
yeah.
taught ethics in seminary, all right, this was
Hmm.
second year class, and these were people preparing for the pastorate. The first thing I would do in the ethics class was hand out blank sheets of paper and ask the students to write out, not in full, not every word, but the gist of the Ten Commandments. And even in seminary, hardly any of them could do it. So
Wow.
it might be a good idea to say, what is the 10th commandment?
Well, the Tenth Commandment is that we shouldn't covet our neighbor's anything, our
Yeah.
neighbor's um, our neighbor's car or wife or house or wealth or anything. Um, to do so is to
How about his power?
disregard trust in God to provide for us each in the way that He will. You see, and I think the natural affinity in our fallen hearts to be envious, to be covetous, was exploited by Marx, and that's one of the reasons that it's so potent an argument. Nowadays, of course, we have what we call cultural Marxism, where the same sort of divide and conquer kind of idea is used against men and women, dividing men from women. Two that in right understanding would be cooperative, would work together to see their lives as intertwined and supporting one another and so on. But he divides men from women. Well, the cultural Marxist divides men from women and then pits them against each other, saying women are oppressed. Or you can pit races against each other, or I'd rather say ethnic groups, rather, because we're all one race. There's a human race. But you can do it with that. You can do it between homosexuals and heterosexuals. You can do it between any division that you can accomplish where one group feels slighted by the other can be exploited in this what is really an application of Marxism. So we want our students to be able to spot a Marxist argument when they hear it, And so we read the Communist Manifesto. If we had more time, we'd read some of Das Kapital, but we don't. So we have to pick and choose our works.
Yes, Das Kapital, the first edition of the first volume of which was dedicated to a Scotsman by the name of Robert Owen, who was teaching basically socialist communism or communist socialism long before Marx began doing it, and who later came to the United States and tried to found some communes in various different places around New York and Ohio and a
Yeah,
few other places.
yes, Ohio and
And
Indiana.
they,
I remember hearing
they
about that.
all failed. They
They
all
all failed.
failed and ceased even to exist, except one of them. And that one uh, managed to continue its existence by turning from communism to capitalism, and that was the Oneida Colony, which
Huh.
is the source of Oneida silverware and stainless steel flatware for tables
Oh, sure.
and
I've heard
other
of
such
that. I
things.
didn't.
Yeah, all
So
of
they
that comes
started
from
out
the
as
Oneida
communists.
community. Yes, right. They started out as communists. That didn't work, and they turned to capitalism and have done well since then. Yeah.
You were
Okay.
talking about
So
not knowing history. Uh, we don't know that history. Burke and the founders of this country understood their history. They knew their Greek philosophers who
yep.
argued against against democracy. And you were
Right.
talking about how democracy can be the tyranny of the majority. And that's what
Or
they
even of the
understood, and that's
minority.
why they created a republic instead of a democracy. A democracy was a bad
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
So it's because they knew their history, you see. In the same way that we could avoid another fall into communism if we could just know our history of communist failures around the world, including in our country.
Yeah. I'll take the opportunity to recommend one other podcast. Not sure that this is sort of the typical thing that one does on one's own podcast or one's own live stream is to recommend others, but hey, I don't mind the
Oh,
competition.
it's a good
But
idea.
there is a podcast out called The Cold War, What We Saw, that is,
Yeah.
I think, one of the most amazing tours through 20th century history. Brilliantly read, brilliantly written, and can really help a lot of younger people who, frankly, if you were born past about the mid 1970s, you really don't know very well what it was like to live during the height of the Cold War and with
That's
the just unbelievable threats to sheer survival that we faced at that time. But this is a tremendous podcast. Well,
It's
now
by a
we're
fellow
about
called,
ready to.
called I just want to give a plug to the guy's name. His name is Bill Whittle,
Yes,
who did
Bill
that
Whittle.
yes, Bill Whittle did this Cold War set of podcasts, and they are
Yeah,
wonderful, really, really good.
yeah. So we're about now ready now to dive into tonight's actual topic, waking up to woke. But
Uh,
I want to just give a quick reminder first that to the end of June, which means till midnight tomorrow, as our way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax deductible donation to the Cornwall Alliance of any size and request it, we'll be glad to send you a copy of this wonderful book, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Short chapters, very clear and simple to understand, designed for anybody with a 10th grade education or above to be able to handle it. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, type in promo code 21-06. That's 21-06. Or type in the full title, Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Don't just type in climate change. We have a number of other resources of that title. But Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. And as long as our supply lasts, we will be glad to send you a free copy. Now, we have a quick comment from Guy Takamatsu watching us on Facebook right now. Guy says that Burke is called conservative today, but in his time was considered a liberal. And to this day, the
right.
Conservative Party in Australia is what is called the Liberal Party. And what we would call liberals are the Labour Party. Basically the same thing is the case in Great Britain. The Conservative Party is the Tories. The Liberal Party is the classical liberals in favor of free markets, free speech, limited government, the rule of law, and so on. And the Labour Party is much more socialistic in its thinking. So yeah, that is certainly the case. And it's one of the fascinating turns of history to see how those terms changed their meaning over time. But now we're seeing some other terms change meaning over time. Terms like justice or racism or what it means to be awake or to have progress, privilege, and so on. The woke movement, the progressive movement, has really redefined a lot of terminology for us. Now, to be racist is not simply to harbor animosity against others solely because of their skin color or something like that. It counts as racism only if you are a part of the hegemonic power structure. And that happens only if you are not only a majority numerically, but really in power and enjoying great privilege and the ability to oppress others. Now, the biblical definition of justice includes the demand for impartiality. We don't play any favorites. We don't say, well, I'm going to, do good things to these people because of their color or because of their ethnic background or because they're rich or because they're poor or because they're male or because they're female or anything like that. The biblical principle of justice says that we're supposed to be impartial, totally fair, not play favorites in any way. We should render to everyone his due. The woke movement has been infiltrating churches, changing a lot of people's thinking about a great many different things. The very idea of anti-racism now has come to mean not just being opposed to racial prejudice, but being committed to the idea that all whites are, by definition, because they're white, racists. And blacks, because they're not the majority in the culture, cannot be racists, no matter how prejudiced they might be against others. So the philosopher George Santayana, as I said earlier, said those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And the Center for Western Studies is designed to help people remember the past, learn the lessons from it, and then apply those lessons today. So let's take up some of the central ideas of that movement, starting with social justice. John, what is it, and how does it compare with justice as we understand that from the Bible?
This issue is such a huge issue, and it has so many facets now, and it has tentacles into so many parts of our country. We actually decided to have, we have a podcast, here at the Center for Western Studies. I could plug our podcast. You can find it on...
Absolutely.
Sorry?
Absolutely, do it. Plug it.
Well, yeah. You can find it on our website, but you can also find it in all the podcast apps too, if you like. But it's called From the Center. And we talked about the elements and the facets of this social justice critical theory notion. And you were kind enough to come on and speak with us on 2 of the episodes. We had an episode with our friend Karl Dillon, who's a pastor here in town, to talk about what justice is in biblical definitions, some of what you just mentioned. Another pastor friend of mine and missionary, Ronnie Stevens, came and talked about the notion of forgiveness on a different episode. We had Doug Groteis, the professor of apologetics at Denver Seminary, a friend of mine, come on and talk about why it is that this whole social justice movement is so popular among evangelicals today, which is an interesting question. You came and talked about rights, positive and negative rights, among other things. I recommend those. In fact, we talked so long, we turned out that one session into 2 different episodes. So we have 2 episodes with you. And one of my faculty members here at the center is doing his PhD on critical literary theory. And so I thought he'd be a good one to talk about the history of cultural Marxism, Marxism in general, but cultural Marxism in particular. The Gramsci cultural Marxism in the 30s, I guess, and the Germans, Horkheimer and some of the others. Anyway, I don't want to go into it all, but the point is that people can listen to those podcasts. We must have 8 or so of them in a row that are about this issue, and then a summary in the last one. So I recommend those if you're interested in getting deeper into it. But
John,
justice,
your website, your URL is centerws.org.
Com.
Centerws.com. Yeah.
That's right. Centerws.com. There you go. And if you look under content there, you see the middle button there, word, you can find the podcasts all listed there. So you can listen to them right there, or you can go on your app, your Stitcher app or your Apple Podcast app or whatever, and look for, there, see it there. Thank you, Jim, for that. That takes you to our podcast from the center. And if you scroll down there, you see just how many there are. We've been doing it now for, 3.5 years, I guess. But these last 8 or 9 of them are dealing with social justice. So I say that here because it might help explain it all better than my trying to take the time on our deal right now to outline the differences. But in a nutshell, justice in the Bible is a very different animal than what we call social justice. Adding that adjective social changes the notion of justice into a very particular kind of remedy for what is sensed as injustice. And that particular kind of remedy is almost always government-inspired redistribution of wealth and power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite a different mindset than how you just described biblical justice that has to do with giving each his due in the court system, under the law. There are really only 2 places where people are equal. We're really not, we like to think of ourselves as equal, but there are really only 2 ways that people are equal. They're equal under God, and they're equal under the law. And everywhere else, we're different. And those differences are okay. That's all right to have differences. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact,
they're not just okay, they're wonderful.
Right.
They're wonderful.
So, but a lot of times now, the envy that we were talking about earlier is used as a kind of a wedge or a crowbar to force people into animosity against one another, and then power can step in and take over, and that's a very ugly description. There are many people who believe in social justice that are honest to goodness and believe in their hearts that they're doing a good thing, but we think that there's an awful lot that is not good, and many people are ignorantly embracing the notion of social justice without really diving into it very deeply. As well as I do, the economist Friedrich Hayek, wrote extensively about social justice quite a while ago. And one of the things he says in one of his books is that he hopes that if he could do anything, he would hope to make everyone ashamed of using the word social justice and never use it again, because of the fact of how he defines it. I turn you over to Hayek to see how he defines it, but he finds lots of problems with it, and we do too.
Yeah. One could wish that he had been more successful in bringing it about that nobody would ever speak of social justice. If social justice simply meant justice spread all through society so that everybody gets treated justly, fairly,
Yeah.
okay?
Yes.
That would be wonderful, but that's
I'd be all
not
for that.
what it means. Yeah, that's not what it has come to mean in the actual usage
Exactly.
of the term, stretching clear back into the early 19th century when it was first coined. It's basically been uh, a tame way of expressing Marx's notion that everybody deserves an equal share of society's total pie without regard to performance. And
Right.
that just simply is not a biblical concept. I mean, the Apostle Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, if someone will not work, not if he can't, but if he will not work, don't even let him eat. So, I mean, food is a pretty important thing. And if people's willingness to work is a determinant of whether they ought to eat, then I think the idea that everybody's do the same thing regardless of behavior is pretty clearly unbiblical. Um, I've discussed all of this, of course, and you and I talked about it a good bit in our what turned out to be two-part podcast. In my book,
Right.
Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. And we would offer this also. In fact, we offer this pretty much all the time, free as a way of saying thank you when people make a gift of any size to the Cornwall Alliance and ask for it. So again, if you'd like a copy of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply type in social justice, and we'll know that you're asking for a copy of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel, and we'll send it to you. And 100% of your donation will be tax deductible. John, you mentioned critical theory, critical race theory. Uh, those are enormous concepts. We could talk
Yeah.
about those for a couple of hours, but can you just, sum them up very briefly? What is critical theory about, and why do you find it to be incompatible with a biblical worldview, and particularly with biblical ethics?
Well, it is a huge topic. Um, in the universities over the last 60, 70 years, 50, less than that, 50 years, say, um, there have been parallel tracks in many of the schools, the School of Architecture, the School of Biology, or the School of Music, and so on. Parallel tracks that they would call critical biology or law or music or whatever, critical theory. And that critical theory draws its critique, if you will, basically from the cultural Marxists that we've mentioned so far. The idea is that in every area of life, um, the oppression of the poor or the oppression of one or another ethnic group or the oppression of some sort of minority, women in particular, even though maybe women aren't a minority, but they're included in the list. Uh, that somehow we have to understand biology or law in light of that mindset, that this is what's going on, that there is this oppression that's happening, and that it reorients that subject to an ideology. An ideology, we argue, is anything that ends in ISM. Feminism, rationalism, communism, socialism, um, any of that, any of those things. And so an ideology places itself at the highest level of authority, what we call the summum bonum, the highest good, and then interprets everything in life through the lens of that mindset, that ideology. And so critical race theory is the assumption that that the problems between the races explain everything, and
Yeah.
you can begin to see that in the 1619 project out of the New York Times, that is attempting to rethink and redefine the significant events in American history based around when the first slaves came, rather than based around the Declaration of Independence in 1776, where we think the country really started. And it's for the reasons I just mentioned, that this is somehow the better explanation for who we are, where we came from, what we're doing, what's good, what's not. An ideology is as close as I can imagine to a new religion. It teaches you
Mm-hmm.
what's right and wrong. It tells you how how you can be redeemed. It teaches you, gives you priests and prophets and so on, and gives you all of the sort of elements of religion, but in terms of the ideology. And so, critical race theory is one of many critical theories that are being
Yeah.
propagated that come from that mindset. If that helps.
Yeah. I think at the very heart of all the different types of critical theory, or all the different departments, so to speak, of critical theory,
Mm-hmm.
is this notion that the whole purpose of scholarship, the whole purpose of the academy, the whole purpose, frankly, of everyone's life who is truly awake and attuned, is to critique the ways in which dominant culture, dominant people shaping culture, oppress other people through, whether it's racism or sexism or classism or intellectualism. I mean, we even now have critical mathematics theory and critical science theory. You mentioned critical biology. Now the critical theory folks are telling us that mathematics is a tool of oppression
That's
by
right.
the white race, the
That's
privileged,
right.
hegemonic white race. And we need to be freed from that tool of oppression. Or they're telling us that logic is
Exactly.
a white oppression mechanism, and that we need to be freed from that. What all of this does really is to rebel against the existence of transcendent, universal, absolute truths and norms. And instead, it finds all of the norms of society in either the oppressor class or the oppressed class.
That's right.
And because they are oppressor and oppressed, their norms will necessarily conflict, and there will always be warfare until one of them subdues the other. And so this, I think, is part of what is behind the demands now in America under critical race theory for reparations from
Yes.
all whites to all blacks, despite the fact that, of course, only a fairly small minority of whites in America have ancestors, and now we're thinking like 4 or more generations back, who ever owned slaves or dealt in slaves, etc. And despite the fact that that whites were enslaved in America back in those times too. Slavery in America did not start out as a racially based thing. In fact, some of the earliest slaves in America were whites owned by blacks. And some of the black slave owners were themselves blacks as well.
Right.
Owners of black slaves were themselves blacks. And so we're getting the message that the only way to correct the oppression that was done in the past is to demand of the present generation that it make reparations to the present generation of descendants of those who were victims in the past. And of course, there are all kinds of problems with that. How can you determine who owes what to whom? How about the people whose ancestors fought on on the side that was aiming to abolish slavery. Should they be making reparations? How about those who were abolitionists and so on? Critical theory, I think, just horrendously oversimplifies history, and
Right.
it reads it all through the lens of its particular ideology. And then I think one of the most tragic things about it is something that you have talked about, I think, very, very eloquently, John, and that is how it substitutes retribution for reconciliation and forgiveness.
Yes.
Develop that for us a little bit. We just have about 5 minutes or so left in the program, and I
The
think that's
yeah,
a good theme to end on.
the key element that's missing from this sort of religion of this ideology of critical theory uh, is is forgiveness. That's why we did that whole podcast on forgiveness alone. I'm very concerned that we are teaching now, even through the church, through evangelical churches, that there are some sins, for the sake of argument, allow that they happened. I mean, nobody disclaims that there was abuse of people under slavery. I'm not arguing
Yeah,
that point, but I'm saying if
absolutely.
if the if the reality is that there's an oppressor and an oppressed, and the Christian teaching is from the Sermon on the Mount. You've been told to love your neighbors and hate your enemies, but what I tell you is to love your enemies and pray for your persecutors. If under critical theory that takes the place really of this religion we call Christianity, is kind of an alternative to Christianity, there's no forgiveness there. There's no loving of your enemy. And what concerns me the most, I think, is that the church being swept up into this social justice movement is thinking that it's just and right and good and godly for people to hold grudges when they've been offended, and
Yeah,
to demand retribution, and to demand a kind of eye for an eye, to return to an eye for an eye kind of thing, where you oppressed us in the last generation, so we're going to oppress you now, kind of thing. And there's nothing like that in Christianity. And so what it's all missing is this element of reconciliation by way of forgiveness. That's a tall order. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say it's an easy thing to do. In fact, I think it requires supernatural ability. But for those who know that they have been forgiven themselves, there's a possibility that they can forgive their fellow servant. But I think for those who have rejected the idea that they themselves are sinners and need to be forgiven and have been forgiven by God's work on the cross, they are not going to be able, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to be able to forgive those who have offended them. And so, what we really need to do is be teaching the gospel, it seems to me.
yeah,
And it may be lost,
yeah.
in this sweep. If the churches go under, then and give up the idea that forgiveness is really at the center of reconciliation, then I think we're going to be a culture that has lost its salt, as Jesus warned.
Yeah, and in the most literal sense of losing the soul too. I mean, I I go to the Lord's Prayer. You know, our Father who art in
Yeah,
heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts
but
as we forgive our debtors.
it's right
Pardon me.
there.
Forgive us. And do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. And Jesus follows that with this comment: For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. Now,
Wow.
one way to read that is to say, okay, I earn my forgiveness by forgiving others. But that's clearly not the case, because it is not by works of righteousness that we have done, but by the washing of regeneration and the renewal of the Holy Spirit that we are made right with God. We are justified not by works, but by faith. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 3, and the whole first 6 chapters of Romans are all dedicated to this message, and most of the book of Galatians is dedicated to this message, and so on. So that means that we can't read this as saying, all right, I'm going to earn my forgiveness, I'm going to earn my reconciliation with God, I'm going to earn my salvation by forgiving others. So what then does Jesus mean when he says, if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions? Well, I think there's only one way really to understand that, and that is to recognize that if I don't forgive others, then that is the clear sign that I do not understand the grace of God, and that I have not humbled myself to confess that I need that grace, that grace is the only way that I can stand right in God's sight. And if that's the case, then I have not been forgiven, and I will not be forgiven until I abandon all claim of my own righteousness and appeal only to the grace of God shown in Jesus Christ's death on the cross, paying the penalty that I owed for the sin that I committed, and his resurrection from the dead in triumph over condemnation and death. If I do not forgive others, I reveal by that I don't know the gospel.
That's right.
And so this is why,
because the realization, the realization of how much you have been forgiven, and when I say you, I mean me, the way how much we have, how much we've been to begin to plumb the depths of how much I've actually been forgiven, puts me in a mindset to see the sins that you've done against me in a completely different light.
It does.
And it's that parable of the servant who owed 10,000 talents and then wouldn't and was forgiven, and then couldn't forgive his fellow servant 100 denarii. The difference between them is astronomical in numbers of sin. Every sin that, say I oppress you, when I oppress you, the first person that sinned against is God, not you. So every sin that anybody has ever done, oppressing anybody at any time, has first been an offense against God. Each of us owes that to God, and thanks be to God, he has provided us a way to be forgiven. But once we realize how much we've been forgiven, he who's been forgiven much loves much. Isn't that what we're told?
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's what we need here, is that ability to forgive those who have offended us.
Yeah. We have a comment from a Facebook viewer, Chris Reimers, says, I really appreciate your insights, fellows. CRT only results in the end with tragic consequences. Forgiveness and reconciliation are indeed so much more godly than coveting what others have. I would think this would be obvious, but sadly, we are living in a time when many don't see it. And I think that's exactly right. And what that means is that it is all the more incumbent on those who do see it, especially if they're pastors, elders in churches, teachers in Christian schools, and so on, to get this lesson across. It's about time to finish up here. I want to just quickly recommend 3 sources for our viewers who want to study this in more depth. In addition to my short book, Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, I want to recommend these 3. Voddie Baucham's book, Fault Lines, Cynical Theories, Fault Lines, The Social Justice Movement and Evangelicalism's Looming Catastrophe. This is by Southern Baptist theologian and pastor Voddie Baucham, and it is truly amazingly insightful. Much of the insight grows out of his own experience, having grown up as a fatherless boy in the Black Ghetto, and having experienced many of the things that people make an excuse for embracing critical race theory and social justice. And he shows how the gospel brings an entirely different perspective to this. A very, very advanced academic and yet still highly readable book on this subject is Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay's book, Cynical Theories: How Activist Scholarship Made Everything About Race, Gender, and Identity, and Why This Harms Everybody. This is, I think, a path-breaking book. It's truly one of the most deep and thorough studies of the entire critical movement in the academy, and how it has infiltrated into popular culture as well. And then the third is a much more popular level book called Why Social Justice is Not Biblical Justice: An Urgent Appeal to Fellow Christians in a Time of Social Crisis by Scott David Allen. This book is one that is written by somebody who's sort of in the throes of watching his own church and other churches near him torn apart by the social justice movement, torn apart by critical theory. And he's offering some, I think, very good insights, clearly written, as to why this deviates from biblical ethics. So, John, thanks again for joining us this evening on From the Stacks. I would again recommend that people go and listen to your podcasts on From the Center, available on the various different podcast apps, or by going to the website of the Center for Western Studies, centerws.com, and just click there on content, and you'll be able to find all of the podcasts from there. Any quick closing comment, John? We've run a little over time, but that's okay. It's a podcast, a live stream.
That's right. Well, I'm just grateful to be here, Cal. Thank you for having me on, and thank you for joining me on my podcast. Let's continue to do this good work as God leads us.
Yeah, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, John.
Well, let's both scratch God's.
Folks, next week our topic is going to be really quite different. Our guest will be Larry Bell. Now, Larry Bell is a professor of architecture who specializes in space architecture. That is, the architecture of spacecraft. He's a professor of that at the University of Houston. He founded an institute there for studying and teaching that subject. He's a fascinating man who writes on a wide variety of different topics. And he recently published in Newsmax an article whose title makes a very generous use of alliteration. The title is Beijing Power Play Poised to Pull the Plug on Prospects to Go All Electric. Bell is explaining how Chinese Communist Party international policy with regard to the components of batteries, many of which come from China, are mined primarily in China by, in many instances, slave labor in extremely toxic conditions. The Chinese Communist Party is taking some steps that will make it all the more difficult for people in the West to adopt electric vehicles, as if that were even such a great idea anyway, in that electric vehicles actually turn out to give you fewer miles per unit of energy used than internal combustion vehicles. Anyway, Larry Bell will be our guest next week. One final quick reminder that from now till midnight tomorrow night, the last day of June, when you make a gift of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance and request it, we'll be glad to send you a free copy of Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. To ask for your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org, and click on the donate button, And then as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, type in promo code 21-06, and we'll be glad to send you a free copy of Climate Change, A Convenient Truth. Until next week, thanks again for joining us here on From the Stacks. God bless you, walk with Christ, and forgive as you have been forgiven.